Perhaps you've wondered why our society is so obsessed with the idea of eternal youth for women while celebrating maturity in men. It's not just an arbitrary aesthetic preference, as many believe. It's something much deeper, rooted in the power structures that have shaped our species for millennia. Imagine a 20-year-old woman looking at her reflection in the mirror, searching for signs of aging. She might use anti-aging creams, read about miracle diets, consider cosmetic procedures. Now imagine a 50-year-old man looking into the same mirror, seeing wrinkles around his eyes, gray hair at his temples, and feeling a kind of satisfaction. For him, these are not signs of decay, but of experience, of authority. This discrepancy in how we interpret the same biological phenomenon is not an accident of nature or culture. It's the result of a long evolutionary and social history that has programmed our collective perception in ways we rarely question. And it is this programming, this historical construction of female value tied to youth that we need to reflect upon today. Why do we so naturally accept that women must appear young to be valued, while men can age with dignity? Where does this deeply rooted asymmetry in virtually all human societies come from? To understand this, we must go back long before the modern era, long before even the first civilizations. We must return to the primordial evolutionary environment that shaped our most basic instincts and preferences. About 2 million years ago, when our hominid ancestors were beginning to develop the cognitive abilities that would eventually distinguish us from other species, survival depended on a delicate balance between cooperation and competition. Males competed for access to females, and females selected partners based on criteria that increased the survival chances of their offspring. In this primitive context, female youth was a biological indicator of fertility and reproductive potential, while male maturity signaled experience, accumulated resources, and protective capacity. These basic evolutionary patterns, initially adaptive for species survival, were later incorporated and amplified by the cultural systems we developed. When the first agricultural societies emerged around 10,000 years ago, private property and patrilineal inheritance became central institutions. Control over female sexuality became crucial to ensure that the resources accumulated by a man would be inherited by his biological descendants. In this new context, female youth gained an additional dimension. Beyond signaling fertility, it came to represent purity and control. A young woman was more easily controlled, less experienced, more moldable to the expectations of the emerging patriarchal system. The great civilizations of antiquity codified these preferences in their laws, religions, and customs. In the Code of Hammurabi, in the laws of Manu, in biblical texts, we repeatedly find the valorization of female virginity, strict regulation of women's behavior, and the normalization of unions between mature men and very young women. It was not uncommon for girls aged 12 or 13 to be given in marriage to men 3 or 4 times older. This age asymmetry in heterosexual relationships was institutionalized as the norm in practically all complex societies in history. Greek mythology offers us an interesting example of this dynamic. The goddesses associated with beauty and desire, like Aphrodite, are eternally young, while male gods, like Zeus, are depicted as mature, bearded, and wise. This duality reflects and reinforces the cultural association between femininity and youth, masculinity and maturity, in the stories we tell about ourselves, in the images we create of human ideals. This asymmetry is deeply embedded. During the European Middle Ages, the average marriage age for women was significantly lower than for men, and the age gap between spouses was considered natural and desirable. Medical and philosophical treatises of the time justified this practice based on theories about the complementary nature of the sexes. The heat and youthful vitality of women balancing the coldness and rationality of male maturity. What we now recognize as a cultural construct meant to preserve patriarchal power structures was then naturalized as divine order or natural law. The Renaissance, with its celebration of the human body and obsession with classical beauty, further intensified the cult of female youth. Raphael's Madonnas, Botticelli's Venuses, and the muses of countless artists cemented in the Western imagination the ideal of the eternally young woman as the supreme object of beauty and desire. Male portraits from the same period, in contrast, exalted signs of maturity, authority, and experience. By portraying men and women so differently, Renaissance art not only reflected, but also reinforced and perpetuated existing gender and age asymmetries in society. The modern era, far from breaking these ancestral patterns, found new ways to express and intensify them. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of consumer society discovered the economic potential of women's insecurity about aging. The cosmetics industry, initially modest in the 19th century, became the multi-billion-dollar giant we know today, fueled primarily by women's fear of losing social value as they age. Never before in history have so many resources been invested in the artificial maintenance of youthful female appearance. Market capitalism proved extremely effective at monetizing and, consequently, amplifying anxieties deeply rooted in our collective psyche. At the same time, the development of photography and later cinema and television created a new regime of visibility that intensified the objectification of the female body. For the first time in history, idealized images of youthful feminine beauty could be reproduced and disseminated on a massive scale. The psychological impact of this omnipresence of perfect, eternally young bodies has not yet been fully understood. But it has certainly contributed to a growing anxiety about aging, especially among women. It is interesting to note that even revolutionary movements that questioned almost every aspect of the traditional social order often failed to critically examine this gender asymmetry in the aging process. Marxism, for example, with its sophisticated analysis of production and exploitation relations, rarely addressed systematically the issue of female youth as social and sexual capital. Even the early waves of feminism focused on fundamental political and economic rights, did not prioritize questioning this specific aspect of gender inequality. Only in recent decades, with the development of more complex intersectional analyses, have we begun to critically examine the tyranny of eternal youth imposed on women. And we have discovered that this demand is not just a superficial aesthetic preference, but a control mechanism deeply intertwined with other systems of power and domination. The pressure to remain young does not affect all women in the same way. It intersects with race, social class, sexual orientation, and other dimensions of identity, creating complex patterns of privilege and oppression. Black women, for example, often face the paradox of being simultaneously hypersexualized and considered less feminine or desirable according to dominant Eurocentric standards. The demand for eternal youth takes on specific contours when filtered through structural racism. Women from privileged social classes have access to resources that allow them to come closer to beauty and youth ideals, creating a new form of social distinction based on appearance. Lesbian and queer women may experience different pressures in communities that have developed their own aesthetic norms, partly as resistance to heteronormative standards. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this technological future we're discussing most awakens your fear or apprehension? Do you lie awake at night thinking about it too? I know that many times we keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of seeming paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your worries are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. My greatest fear about our technological future is your voice can help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin to imagine ways to confront them. The digital era has introduced new complexities into this panorama. On one hand, social media and selfie culture have intensified scrutiny over women's appearance to unprecedented levels. Never before have women been so consistently exposed to images of themselves and constant comparisons to idealized standards. On the other hand, these same platforms have enabled movements of resistance and redefinition. Online communities celebrating body diversity, natural aging, and beauty at all ages have proliferated as counterpoints to the dominant narrative. Biotechnology and contemporary aesthetic medicine represent another intriguing paradox. The same advances that allow increasingly sophisticated interventions to simulate or preserve youth also help us better understand the biological processes of aging and potentially free ourselves from the limitations imposed by the body. We are simultaneously more bound to the tyranny of youth and closer to technologically transcending it. The near future promises to intensify these contradictions. Genetic engineering, regenerative medicine, brain-machine interfaces, and other emerging technologies have the potential to radically transform our relationship with aging. For the first time in human history, the possibility of significantly extending lifespan and even reversing aspects of biological aging no longer seems like mere fantasy. But who will have access to these technologies? How will they affect our social structures and our conceptions of gender? Will the promise of prolonged youth expand or reduce existing inequalities? These questions lead us to a deeper reflection on what we truly value in women and why. If female youth has historically been valued primarily for its reproductive potential and its pliability to patriarchal structures, what happens when reproduction becomes increasingly detached from the natural female body through technologies such as in vitro fertilization, artificial wombs, and other biomedical innovations? What happens when longevity and bodily modification become technically possible for everyone, regardless of gender? A fundamental transformation in our conception of human value seems both inevitable and necessary. If we wish to create a more equitable and humanistic future, we must question not only the superficial manifestations of gender asymmetry in aging, but its deeper roots in our systems of value. We must ask, what truly makes a human life, regardless of gender, valuable and meaningful? A broader perspective suggests that our obsession with female youth reflects an extremely limited and impoverished understanding of human potential. Societies that waste the wisdom, experience, and power of mature women are depriving themselves of invaluable resources. Cultures that teach girls to fear aging rather than embrace it as a process of growth and empowerment are perpetuating a form of collective self-mutilation. Some non-Western traditions offer interesting counterpoints to the dominant narrative. In several indigenous cultures, for example, older women often hold positions of great prestige and authority, being valued precisely for the wisdom accumulated with age. In certain African and Asian traditions, menopause marks not a decline in female social status, but an elevation, freeing women from certain restrictions traditionally imposed on female behavior during reproductive years. These cultural alternatives remind us that our current conception is neither universal nor inevitable. Even within the Western tradition, we can find historical periods and social contexts where female maturity was more valued. In the Victorian era, for instance, middle-aged women of privileged classes often enjoyed considerable social influence and moral authority, though within the limits of the gender roles of their time. In the Italian Renaissance, some wealthy and educated widows achieved significant positions of cultural and economic power. These examples, though limited, suggest that even within patriarchal systems, there are fissures and possibilities for alternative forms of valuation. The fundamental question, however, is not simply to invert the existing hierarchy by valuing maturity above youth. The true challenge is to completely transcend this system of evaluation based on appearance and age. We need to build a culture that recognizes the intrinsic worth of human beings at all stages of life. A society where young and old, men and women alike, are valued for who they are, not for what they represent according to ancestral narratives of power and control. What would such a society look like? Let us imagine communities where intergenerational collaboration replaces competition for scarce resources, where the wisdom of elders complements the energy of youth, where social value is measured by contribution to the common good rather than conformity to arbitrary aesthetic standards. Let us imagine economic and political institutions that recognize and reward forms of work traditionally feminized and devalued, such as caregiving, maintaining community bonds, and transmitting traditional knowledge. Let us imagine technologies developed not to reinforce insecurities and perpetuate inequalities, but to expand human capacities and facilitate meaningful connections. This is not an impossible utopia, but a possible direction for our cultural evolution. Just as we built the systems that currently constrain us, we can deconstruct them and rebuild alternatives more conducive to full human flourishing. But for that, we must first recognize the artificiality and historical contingency of our current structures. We must see that what appears natural and inevitable is in fact the product of collective choices made over millennia, often to serve specific power interests. The demand for eternal youth in women is not a law of nature, but a social construct that has served primarily to limit female power and maintain patriarchal structures. By recognizing this, we take the first step toward imagining and creating alternatives. By questioning why we value what we value, we open space for new systems of worth that are more inclusive and humanistic. This questioning is not merely theoretical, but deeply personal and political. Every time a woman decides to embrace her natural aging instead of fighting it, every time we celebrate the beauty and wisdom of female maturity, every time we recognize a woman's worth beyond her appearance or reproductive capacity, we contribute to a necessary and urgent cultural transformation. Some will argue that our aesthetic preferences are biologically determined, that male attraction to female youth is an immutable evolutionary instinct. But history and anthropology show us the immense plasticity of human sexuality and desire. What is considered attractive varies enormously across cultures and historical periods. Even within the same society, standards of beauty and desirability are constantly shifting. What seems like a natural instinct is often the product of deep cultural conditioning. Others will argue that women themselves choose to pursue eternal youth, that no one forces them to use anti-aging creams or undergo plastic surgery. But this is a superficial understanding of how socialization operates within systems of power. When a given trait is consistently associated with higher social, economic, and sexual value, individual choice takes place within a severely restricted field of possibilities. True freedom is not merely choosing among predefined options, but participating in defining which options exist and how they are valued. The necessary change is both individual and systemic. Individually, we can work to recognize and challenge our own internalized biases about aging and gender. We can practice appreciating beauty in all its manifestations, not only those conforming to narrow, youthful ideals. We can celebrate and value the women in our lives for their intelligence, wisdom, courage, compassion, and countless other qualities that have nothing to do with youth or appearance. Systemically, we must transform the institutions that perpetuate the devaluation of women as they age. We need more diverse representation in media, advertising, film, and television. We must challenge age discrimination in the job market, which disproportionately affects women. We must question the billion-dollar industries that profit from female insecurity. We need to develop new cultural narratives that portray aging as a process of growth and expansion, not of decline and loss of worth. Technology, which has largely been complicit in intensifying the tyranny of youth, can potentially become an ally in subverting it. The same digital platforms that spread unrealistic beauty ideals can also connect resistance communities and amplify alternative voices. The same biotechnologies currently used mainly to simulate youth could be redirected to improve quality of life at all ages without necessarily erasing the natural signs of time. Our relationship with time and mortality lies at the heart of this issue. The obsession with eternal youth ultimately reflects our fear of death and our difficulty accepting the transient nature of existence. But there are healthier and deeper ways to confront our mortality than projecting this fear onto the aging female body. Philosophical and spiritual traditions around the world offer resources for developing a more mature relationship with time and finitude. Buddhism, for example, teaches impermanence as a fundamental characteristic of all phenomena, inviting us to find freedom in accepting transience rather than in futilely resisting it. Stoic philosophy encourages us to contemplate our mortality not as a curse to be denied, but as a fact that gives meaning and urgency to life. Even within the Abrahamic traditions, we find profound reflections on the beauty and unique value of every stage of human existence. Perhaps the true challenge is not how to remain eternally young, but how to live fully at every age, how to embrace the unique possibilities and gifts of each phase of life. Perhaps true freedom lies not in denying time, but in reconciling with it. And perhaps true beauty is not a fixed state of youth to be preserved, but the authentic expression of a life lived with presence, purpose, and integrity. Throughout history, women who have defied the demand for eternal youth have often found forms of power and influence inaccessible to those who remained trapped within this limiting paradigm. Consider historical figures such as Eleanor Roosevelt, who reached the height of her political influence in her later years, or artists like Georgia O'Keeffe, whose most powerful works were created during her maturity and old age. Think of contemporary activists like Gloria Steinem, who continues to inspire and lead in her 80s, or writers such as Toni Morrison, whose most acclaimed works were produced after the age of 50. These women represent a powerful counter-narrative to the myth that a woman loses her value as she ages. They show us that female maturity, far from being a period of decline, can be a phase of extraordinary creative, intellectual, and political blossoming. They remind us that the qualities that truly matter and endure wisdom, courage, compassion, and integrity often deepen and become richer with age. Historically, the societies that most severely restricted and devalued mature women also tended to be those most resistant to social and intellectual progress in general. It is no coincidence that authoritarian regimes often emphasize traditional female roles centered on youth, beauty, and submission. Conversely, societies that have managed to embrace the talents and contributions of women of all ages tend to be more innovative, adaptable, and humanitarian. There is a profound connection between how we treat female aging and our collective capacity for positive cultural evolution. We are living in a time of profound global demographic transformation. For the first time in human history, due to medical advances and declining birth rates, many societies have more elderly citizens than young ones. This new demographic reality makes it even more urgent to develop a culture that values and fully integrates people of all ages. Ageism, in all its forms, has become not only ethically problematic, but pragmatically unsustainable. To the young women listening to me, I want to say, you are worth infinitely more than your appearance or your youth. Do not allow a culture obsessed with superficialities to convince you otherwise. Develop your talents, follow your passions, cultivate your wisdom. These are the resources that will truly enrich your lives and allow you to contribute meaningfully to the world. Youth is fleeting, but the character, intelligence, and compassion you nurture will endure and deepen with time. To the mature and elderly women, I want to say, your experience and wisdom are priceless treasures in a world that desperately needs perspective and depth. Do not allow yourselves to be erased or silenced by a culture that fails to recognize your worth. Your voices, stories, and knowledge are more necessary than ever. Every time you refuse to apologize for existing visibly and powerfully in a mature body, you open the way for future generations. For all of us, regardless of age or gender, the challenge is to collectively reimagine our relationship with time, the body, and human worth. We need to create new narratives and new structures that honor the wholeness of human experience in all its temporal complexity and diversity. We must develop a culture that recognizes beauty, value, and meaning in every stage of life, that celebrates youth without fetishizing it, and that respects maturity without fearing or rejecting it. This is not a simple or quick task. We are challenging deeply rooted patterns of thought and behavior, power structures that have existed for millennia. But profound cultural transformations are possible, as demonstrated by other significant changes in our systems of value throughout history. Slavery, once considered natural and inevitable, is now universally condemned. The idea of universal human rights, once radical, has become a global consensus, at least in theory. Concepts of gender and sexuality have transformed dramatically in just a few generations. If we have been able to achieve these fundamental changes in our collective worldview, surely we can transform our relationship with aging and gender. Surely we can build a culture that values women for their full humanity, not for their conformity to arbitrary ideals of youth and beauty. Surely we can create societies where the natural process of aging is not treated as a pathology to be fought especially for women, but as a journey to be lived with dignity and celebrated for its unique beauty. The path toward this transformation lies in critical awareness, intergenerational solidarity, and the collective imagination of alternatives. It involves the constant questioning of inherited assumptions, the creation of new narratives and images, and the building of communities that embody more humanistic and inclusive values. It begins with the recognition that by freeing women from the tyranny of eternal youth, we are in fact freeing human potential in its fullest expression. If these ideas have resonated with your own reflections on the world we are building and the challenges we face as individuals, I invite you to join us on this journey of discovery. By subscribing to the channel, you will become part of a community of people who, like you, seek to understand more deeply our human condition in times of accelerated transformation. Each week, we share new perspectives that can illuminate the dark paths we all face in the information age and offer conceptual tools to navigate this new world with greater wisdom and less suffering. We are not alone in this search for meaning and clarity. Subscribe so that we may continue this essential dialogue together about what it means to be human today and what we can become tomorrow. The story of society's obsession with women who do not age is ultimately the story of how we have limited human potential through artificial categories and arbitrary hierarchies. It is the story of how a primitive fear of mortality was projected specifically onto the female body, creating systems of value that have impoverished our cultures and deprived us of the full wisdom and contributions of women at all stages of life. But it is also a story we can collectively rewrite. Imagine a world where girls grow up unafraid of time,